7 kids have gone missing in my town in the last 3 decades. I was a part of the search party for the 7th. This is our story. The child's parents had left him in the care of a neighbor while they ran to the gas station, and the neighbor, an elderly woman, could not keep up with the boy while they played. So she eventually sat to rest. The boy, not at all tired, wanted to keep up playing, but the old woman was exhausted and told him to wait until his parents returned. He asked if he could play with her husband, who lay in bed upstairs, but she said no, explaining to him that her husband was very tired due to his age, like she had become. As any 7-year-old would, the boy found this answer unacceptable and fled to the backyard, hoping to find something or someone to play with. He didn't return. The old woman, whose name was Margaret, had fallen asleep in her living room. She was stirred awake by the sound of the doorbell and shambled over to the front door. Awaiting her there were the boy's parents, whom she greeted, and then remembered that she had been charged with looking after their son. The sudden remembrance, which dawned plainly on the woman's face, brought an immediate worry to the faces of the parents. And the trio began to call out for the boy. Their shouts fell on deaf ears, though. The boy was long gone. I was one of the volunteer searchers, and the particular group I had accompanied was tasked with searching the nearby woods. By the time people had gathered and the police had arrived, it was nearly nightfall, so some of us had to push through the trees and vegetation blindly. A surprising amount of people did not own flashlights. I was one such person. I did bring my father's emergency flare gun, which he thankfully never had to use during his boating days, normally inadvisable considering I'd be surrounded by vegetation, but I figured it would be useful if my group discovered the boy, hopefully alive. I stumbled over roots, pushed through brambles which tore my shirt and cut my skin, and trampled flowers unidentifiable in the gloom. The moonlight shone dimly through the trees whose foliage had formed a natural ceiling over the woods. Eventually, expectedly, I became separate from my search group, lost amidst the unrecognizable flora. Panic crept into my mind, but I figured that with dozens of other people out searching for the boy, I was bound to come across someone. And pushing past panic was the hope that maybe the boy had stumbled through these parts of the woods as well, and I'd be the one to find him. Then, as if to assuage my fears and affirm my hopes, I saw a figure a few meters ahead, leaning against a tree. My heartbeat was faster when I saw that. He was not all that tall, about the size of a boy even. I jogged towards him, but when I grew close enough to see his face, he ran off. I chased after, calling out the boy's name, Adam. It started to rain. I sloshed through the mud which had minutes ago been easily traversable ground. My progress hampered considerably. I could still see the boy ahead, but he grew smaller, fainter, and even though I tried to power through, I felt myself succumbing to the thickening mud. It became like a quicksand, restricting my entire body, resisting my most strenuous exertions. It was too late when I remembered that I was probably quickening my sink with my struggles. Seconds later, I was up to my chin. I'd apparently stumbled upon some deep depression in the earth. Forgetting the flare gun in my pocket, I tried calling out, but the rain fell loudly, drowning out my screams as I drowned in that sinkhole. Darkness rushed in, and all became black. I emerged elsewhere. The earth vomited me forth like a squelch, as if expelling something indigestible. The rain was gone here, and the environment was illuminated by several distinct rays of moonlight, as if this place were watched over by a trio of moons. The trees were different as well. They towered incredibly high, their tops piercing the gray cloudage above, as if rising to greet the triple lunar vanguards. Grass rose as tall as men in some places, while other areas were barren, some sunken in, others raised in mounds of dirt. I progressed forward from the position I'd arrived, hoping that if the boy had come here, I'd find him and if not him, a way to escape. The hole from which I had arisen had smoothed over, leaving no signs of being impregnable. I eventually came across something resembling a path. At the start of this path, to my horror, was a massive coffin that towered nearly as tall as the great trees I'd seen earlier. The coffin's lid was open, and it gave off a strange, sinister impression. It seemed hungrily anticipatory, as if it awaited a soon-to-arrive occupant. I gave it a wide berth as I passed, and nothing sprung out of it to attack or draw me in. I came across other caskets, all of which seemed as they were built for titans. Trees, not as tall as the others but still massive in their own right, had grown through the caskets, throwing the lids off but obscuring any signs of the occupants, if there were any. Great bows pierced through the frame of the casket, giving the trees the appearance of wearing polished wooden armor. As I progressed down the coffin-flanked path, the funerary housing became degraded, more noticeably withered by time, and the trees which grew through them became significantly more prominent, until, at the final tree, the only observable presence of the casket were its splinters which stuck in with what seemed like grim defiance to the trunk of the tree. This tree was as tall as the others I'd initially seen. Something about it, perhaps its age and disregard for the casket through which it had grown, saddened me. There was also a vague, unplaceable familiarity about the casket shards, as if I'd somehow seen them or inexplicably knew of their occupant before coming here. The path lined with casket-infused trees ended 7 in total, and opened to a massive swampish area. In the center of the mire was a massive pool, which over-hovered a soft white mist. Despite the locale, I could hear no bugs or bog-inhabiting creatures, and the water surface was at a complete rest. I approached the pool, drawn into it by some unreal force and my own fixation by its mesmeric surface. Without consciously doing so, I'd walk right into the pool, and only until the water shifted did I notice. The water, which had been a placid and translucent green, turned dark and violent, churning viciously, rocking my body helplessly to and fro. The white mist changed to a dismal red, and suddenly felt like a great encumbrance on my body as I tried to hold my footing in the sloshing waves. Rain started to fall, making the pool's level rise until it was up to my chest. The coffins behind me, engorged by the mammoth trees, seemed to groan in agony as their burdens expanded to nightmarish proportions within them, splintering the wood of which they were made. Beneath me, I began to hear a voice calling from the depths of the pool, and peering in, I saw what looked like a boy. My instinctual desire to extricate myself from the pool was overridden by my desire to save the child, so I plunged downward into the murk. I reached him, surprisingly. I grabbed the boy, who to my short-lived joy resembled Adam. I had found him, somehow trapped in this abysmal place. I held him to me with one arm and used the other to propel myself upward, all the while fighting the monstrous currents which battered me underwater as much as they did above it. When the realization that I wouldn't reach the surface before my lungs burst came to me, I found myself crying, not for my own life but for the boy who I couldn't save. Somehow, the tears felt warm against my body, as if they clung to my face instead of getting mixed within the Stygian waters around me. In a last moment of consciousness, I withdrew the flare gun from my pocket and extended my arm as far as it would go, kicking my legs to hopefully stay close to the surface for the gun to fire properly. I wasn't sure if it was gonna work, honestly, but it was all that I had, and thankfully, my finger pulled the trigger seconds after consciousness fully left me, and we sank downward into the abyssal depth. I awoke in a hospital bed, with a nurse attending to me. She smiled and said she'd go get the doctor. When they returned, they were accompanied by another woman. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her, either due to the drugs assuredly pumped into my system or my own wariness at the half-remembered ordeal. Together, the doctor and woman informed me of what had happened. My absence from the search party had pretty much gone unnoticed until they'd given up for the night, and a sort of roll call was conducted to make sure everyone got back safely. When I hadn't made myself present, the people resumed their search, this time for me, which the woman admitted to being happy about, because she was Adam's mother and hadn't wanted to give up looking for him. Rather than splitting up again and risking more being lost, they surged through the trees together, collectively sweeping through the darkened woods. At some point, perhaps an hour into the search, a flare shot exploded into the sky. Due to the downpour and the thick, visually obstructing treetops, they could only partially trace the path of the flare. They searched the areas from which they suspected it had been fired, but found nothing. Tired and drenched, talk of returning to their homes started up, and some started to make their way back to the neighborhood. Before the last had gone, the woman, Adam's mother, heard crying. She approached the sound and found me holding her son in my arms, wailing, the flare gun at my side. Around us, washed up from a shallow grave, were other children. Adam was the only one alive among them. I was insensate, totally unresponsive, crying dumbly. Adam was unconscious but not seriously harmed. We were both taken to the hospital and I was placated to quietness along the way. When Adam awoke, he told the authorities that the old man, husband of Margaret, had taken him, hurt him, and left him among the others in a shallow pit, which he'd first uncovered to place Adam inside, then afterwards resealed. The rain had washed away the recently piled soil, which had not had time to harden and become overgrown, as had happened since the last time such an atrocity was committed. The old man was arrested, and after a few hours of questioning, admitted to being responsible for the 7 missing children in the last 30 years. Adam, fully recuperated and wanted to thank me. He was brought in and rushed to my bedside. He hugged me, thanked me relentlessly, and his mother did as well. The doctor informed me that I'd be fine and can return home in the evening. They all left, letting me rest. I was happy to see Adam alive and well, but something troubled me. I realized that while he was the boy I'd seen in the water, he definitely was not the one who led me to the place where I'd fallen into the sinkhole. Later, once I returned home, I looked at pictures of the missing children. After scrolling through the pictures, I finally came across the first missing child, who had gone missing in the late 80s. Even though I hadn't got a good look at the child who led me to that sinkhole, I knew that this is the one. I also knew, somehow, that the last casket I'd come across in that extra mundane realm, the one obliterated by the tree, had been his. Has anyone else ever had an experience with performing this ritual? I came across it by sheer coincidence and was wondering if anyone had found a way to escape the loop. If you're unfamiliar with the Stonegate Ritual, I'll do my best to fill you in. You might have passed right by the ritual several times and just never paid any mind to it. It's fairly easy to spot if you know what you're looking for, though. You can't force it to happen. Either you'll happen to find a gate in your path, or you might just go your whole life without seeing one. The word gate is a little misleading though, as all there really is to it is 2 stones. As you walk around, just anywhere will do, I've come to find, you may notice 2 stones on either side of your path. These stones will be oval and fairly flat in shape. Their colors will be similar but different enough to be distinct from one another. It doesn't matter if you're on the sidewalk or a hiking trail. The stone gate can appear anywhere. When you spot these stones and wish to not partake in the ritual, you can simply pass right through them and suffer no consequences. On the other hand, if you do decide to involve yourself with the gate as I did, then you can never stop. Standing in the middle of your path, there will be a stone on either side of you. All you need to do to begin the ritual is choose which stone to pick up. It will be random each time,
but these stones each have their own effect. One will grant you good luck if you are still holding it at the end of the ritual, and the other will give you bad luck if you aren't holding it at the end. As I said, I happened across this ritual by happenstance. I like to go jogging in the nearby woods. I try to make time for it every morning. It's how I justify all the garbage I shove down my throat. While I had just turned around to start heading back home, I stopped for a moment to have a drink. My eyes focused on the trail ahead, one I had run countless times before. I noticed a pair of rocks resting across from each other. Feeling cool streams of water traveling down my cheek after escaping the corners of my mouth, I pondered about the rocks. I wondered how many times I had passed by and failed to notice them, or if they had recently been placed there. They seemed far too picturesque to be an accident, the way the sun bounced off each rock causing them to look like headlights. The more I stood and stared at the set of rocks, the more transfixed I became on their sudden existence. Lowering the water bottle, I stepped forward with a sense of caution that can only come from ancestral uncertainty. With each step, the appearance of the rocks became more abnormal. Drawing closer, I came to the conclusion that they arrived recently. Sitting perfectly on each side of the dirt path, undisturbed by anything and without a speck of dirt on either of them. One was a solid gray while the other shimmered with lighter tones under the morning rays. Kneeling, I ran my fingers across the surface of the right side rock, feeling its smooth and uninterrupted surface. A surface that was surprisingly cool to the touch. Surely, if it had been resting long enough in the sunlight, it would soak some warmth in, but the thing was nearly frigid. I didn't want to interrupt the symmetry, but the rock had such a pristine presentation, I could help but wrap my fingers around it and lift it from the ground. Only the underside of the rock was sullied by fractional clumps of dirt clinging on. With a swipe, my fingers knocked the rolling grains of grime back to the ground. Twisting my wrist around, I observed the nearly hypnotic surface of the rock, it catching ever so gently in the beams peeking through the sparse trees. I'm not the see a cool thing and collect it kind of guy, but even so, I couldn't help but think the rock would be beautiful resting on a shelf. Even more so if I had both of them, so I turned to face the other rock only to discover it was gone. Curiously, I swiveled my head, feeling a wave of static run along my body, prickling my arm hairs as I searched for the other rock. They were so perfectly adjacent from each other that it should have been right behind me, but it wasn't. The forest was pretty quiet in the morning hours, and I heard nothing skittering behind me. Even if there was something, why take the rock? Stepping in the direction of where the other rock should have been, my eye was flooded with a white light. Raising my arm to shield my eyes, I peered further down the trail leading back home, and there it was, reflecting the light into my eyes, almost as if it was beckoning me, was the other smooth rock resting on the left side of the path. Even though it was around 40 or so feet away, the way it bounced the light where it was resting, it was unmistakably the same stone from before. As a lighthouse can lead a ship to land, I started pacing my way down the trail. My vision was so fixated on the other stone that I foolishly ignored the light trickling into my pupil. Without knowing what I was in the middle of, that I had already thrown myself into the Stonegate Ritual, I couldn't have noticed it right away. With every step, the rock that my fingers were still clutched around was becoming heavier. I first really felt its effect once my angled elbow became straight and my hand hanging down at my side. Stopping in place, finally free from the siren call of the stone still ahead of me, I was able to observe my surroundings better. More than just the aching that was starting to develop in my shoulder, I noticed the forest around me was shifting, or rather, it was becoming bleached. The color of the once firmly brown soil that made up the path I traversed was becoming flushed and dull. Green leaves were losing their vibrancy, and the tree bark was becoming a milky shade of what they once were. as if all the colors around me were being washed away. I took a few steps forward, this time keeping an eye on the world around me. Indeed, with each step, I lost a little more of what made the world around me so beautiful. More and more stark black outlines were becoming more apparent, not to mention my grip on the stone in my hand was starting to loosen. Just as the world was washing away, each step made the stone I was holding heavier. My grip was failing, and finger strength was giving away. A few more steps was all it would take for the rock to fall from my hand. When the thought of dropping the rock where I stood crossed my mind, I was filled with an unrivaled sense of dread. Telling my fingers to just drop the stone felt like trying to pass through a solid brick wall. Some part of me, some firing synapses, knew my safety was only assured if I continued to hold the stone. Some part of me knew the stones were a pair that needed to exist across from each other. I had already made it about halfway. If one arm had the strength to carry it that far, then two should have been enough to make it the rest of the way. There's no explanation to why I knew, but I did, that all I could do was keep moving forward. The weight of the stone, ever increasing each step, became harder to perform, as I was already halfway, but the half I still had left was going to take much longer. Even still, the brown dirt faded into a hazy gray, and the foliage lost all luster as the stone grew nearly unbearable. Then, another wave of static shuddered through my body. The feeling of being watched. Such a small stone at that point had accumulated a weight that must have exceeded my own body. Even with both hands cupping it and all my muscles working in tandem, I could feel my knees buckling. It became tough to focus on anything other than fighting it. I did manage to catch several glances though. As the color of the world had nearly vanished altogether, all that remained was the thick black outlines of trees and foliage. These outlines began to squirm. It wasn't as if they were being pushed by a harsh wind. They were waving back and forth. It reminded me of those crazy straws than they did tall, proud trees. My knees were burning, and my back felt as though it was bound to snap, but my destination was within reach. Surroundings up until that point were mute, but as I got closer to the other rock, I heard a hungry chorus of howls perforate the air. The squirming lines beginning to stick together, creating thicker streaks of black. Gritting my teeth, and with the backs of my cupped hands landing on the bleached soil, I dragged myself along. The weight of the rock at this point was too much for my hands. If the weight wasn't shared between both palms, I would no doubt have broken both bones. If I had to travel just a few more feet, I don't think I would have had enough strength. With one last heave, I pulled my hands across the ground, feeling the specks of dirt digging in and ripping my skin, and I offered the world one last glance. So many of the lines had come together, forming one. It was just a jagged line, jutting out in all directions from a central point that had so much girth to it, more girth than any tree I'd ever seen. My feeling of being watched was caused by it. Somehow I knew that thing was looking. And then, it was gone. All of it had vanished. The forest around me flooded with colors and a vibrancy that seemed more intense than ever before. A crushing weight that took my entire body to move a mere inches was once again relegated to the expected weight of just a small stone. A small smooth rock resting in the palm of my hand, on the side of the path, adjacent to the other rock. I slipped the stone from my palm and placed it gently into the soil. Despite the throbbing in my hand and the burning throughout my body, everything had returned to normal. Things had become better than normal. Upon returning to work that day, I discovered that I was being considered for a promotion that month and had gotten it. The pay raise was nice, and when I went to celebrate, I ended up striking up a conversation with a very lovely, very drunk woman who slipped me her number. Everything after that trip to the woods had been coming up roses. I was on top of the world. Things just kept improving. That is, until I saw the rocks again. I had stopped going for so many runs, but still walked to work to keep some semblance of exercise. Stopping dead in my tracks, I begrudgingly noticed the 2 pristine rocks that were laying on either side of my path. Refusing to go through all that again, I just stepped past the rocks without so much offering a second glance. It's not that my life went to crap after that or anything, but I could tell that things had stagnated, that I was no longer rising. I had plateaued. After you participate in the ritual once, you'll begin to see the gates everywhere, and try to do what I did, and just ignore them. However, every time you step through without picking up one, your world will shift. A slow and almost invisible change at first, but each time I passed through or avoided a gate without picking up a stone, my world would lose a little color. Around a week of avoiding the gates was enough to notice the change, and within another week, the feeling of being watched returned. Fearing what would happen next, if whatever that was watched me for too long, I decided to pick up the rock the next time I saw a gate. The next time I picked up the rock, the ritual progressed as normal, only instead of the rock getting heavier, it became lighter. Like the stone was being pumped with helium, it would begin to try and pull my hand upwards. I thought it would be easier to fight the rock, getting heavier, but near the end of the ritual, it became difficult to keep my feet on the ground. That's when the rock slipped from my hand. I dropped to the ground and watched the small rock spiral away from me and into the pure white sky above. I was so close and still, it slipped away from me. That thing, as the seconds went on, moved closer and closer. When I tried to get up and run, I smacked into a wall. I couldn't see anything though, as it was all white and I had no idea where I was anymore. As the undefined line got close enough to touch me, I hear the pitter of something hitting the ground and the ritual ended. I thought I had gotten lucky, but I was wrong. I already explained the rules, so you should have already guessed, but my life fell into disarray. I lost my job, an unfaithful wife, and missed payments. It all came down on me. It would continue until I picked the correct rock and dragged it to the end. That's the game you play when you take part. A life of extreme highs and lows. The more rituals I complete, the more often I'll come across a gate, and it's so exhausting. Not sure how much longer I can keep up with it. Even when I receive the good luck, I can't enjoy it. I know it'll be taken away. Even more than I know now. Even without performing the ritual, even if I get the correct rock every time, it's watching me, waiting for me to break down and give in. It's waiting for me to pass through the stone gate. One final time.
I think that it's finally safe enough for me to tell this story. I've spent the last week in a mansion that was left to rot by some rich millionaire somewhere who has more money than I'll ever have. Their name wasn't important to me at the time, but I won't forget it now. The Wolf family name will forever remain a part of my memory, along with the trauma and horrors that I faced while squatting in their mansion. I've always had the mindset that the ultra-rich just bought houses to flaunt their wealth and never actually used them, and I thought that was the case with this mansion. Boy, could I not have been more wrong. For the first time, while homeless, I was truly terrified to be in a house. I think that once I'm finished fully telling this story, it'll make more sense why someone like me would say that. It's the peak of winter in January, as my time of writing this. I was staying in a house just outside of Detroit when I was chased out by the cops. These people have no care for other humans and only care to enforce the laws that suit them. Seeing as how they wouldn't let me stay in that home, I decided to look around Detroit for a safer place to live. After walking a few miles in the cold, I managed to come across a house that seemed too good of a deal. It was on a single lot facing an empty road that leads off of another neighborhood, and it had its own cul-de-sac. It was a massive house with a street and a driveway all to itself. I found it kind of weird at first for a house like that to be alone, especially cut off from the main street, especially when all of the other houses around it were so massive and expensive looking. Once I got closer to it though, things started to make a little more sense. The house appeared to have been built a long time ago, having probably been built before the rest of the neighborhood, and the owner probably wanted to have his own spot away from the rest of the neighborhood. Greedy bastard. Who goes out of their way to make a separate road for yourself and your big house? Who wouldn't want someone to be there in case you needed some help? It's questions like this that ran through my head as I came up to the front entrance to the house. It was closed off with a massive gate that leads out to the estate, with a row of trees lining each side of the road leading to the mansion. There was a thick fence connected to stone pillars that gated in the entrance to the mansion with the family name of Wolf imprinted above the main gate. But a part of the fence had the bars bent just large enough to allow me to squeeze into it. I decided to enter through it and pass through the bars into the estate. Seeing as how it was later in the evening, the mansion cast a deep shadow over the estate. The empty branches of the trees stretched out like webs, hoping that the long and scraggly lines the shadows made in the snow and dirt would capture something that the soul of the estate would enjoy devouring. I made my way towards the mansion, making sure to hide in between the trees as I made my approach to it. The community I was in wasn't a gated community, but I didn't want to bring any unwanted attention to myself. As I made my way up to the mansion, there seemed to be no signs of life anywhere. Even though it was in the dead of winter, I expected something to be around. Some sound like distant cars honking or random animals moving in the distance. There was nothing, no sound, no voices, not even other people coming into or leaving their house. It almost seemed like everything vanished around me, as far as noise is concerned. All of the lights were dark, and this mansion was no different. The closer I got to it, the more disturbed I felt at the lack of sound. The atmosphere about this house was different in every way that I could really think from a normal house, but it wasn't enough to deter me from the house and risk freezing to death in the cold. The mansion was a large 3-story house with what looked like several rooms and a large entryway. There was a set of double doors at the front that blocked my way from walking inside. I was almost certain that the doors would be locked, but something in my gut told me to try them anyway. To my surprise, they were unlocked and opened up to allow me in. The foyer was massive and led to several different rooms. What was strange about it was that there was a lone TV leading off right next to the staircase that leads upwards to the rest of the house. It appeared to be a tube TV, the last of its kind before flat screens showed up. I remember seeing stuff like this in my uncle's antique shop before it went bankrupt. He would sell TVs like this to people who had the money to waste on collecting useless and outdated junk. Maybe they found some value in it. I don't know. I gravitated towards the TV and decided to play with it. I couldn't find a remote for it, but the buttons on the front of it seemed to work. I turned the TV on and ended up having to tweak it a bit to get it to work. It seemed like a bunch of channels didn't work until I started scrolling up past 100 channels. From there I was able to see the fuzz that the TV was producing start to fade away and the noise alter as the picture took shape and revealed old shows that I used to watch when I was a kid. Old sitcoms played for a while and filled the otherwise empty house with a little bit of comfort as the walls reverberated with the conversations of actors older than the roles that they played, making cheesy jokes and skits over canned laughing tracks. As cringeworthy as that might be, it made me feel a lot more at ease to hear that going on, to just watch the TV for a little while before I went around the house and tried to settle in. I decided to look for a mattress to bring into the main living room so that I could be able to see who was coming and leave at a moment's notice if need be. I went to one of the smaller rooms and pulled out a decent-sized mattress to bring into the living room. I didn't think that I would be there long, but I didn't expect my stay to be very short either. I continued to watch the TV for a bit as I tried to unwind so I could fall asleep. As my eyes began to close, I noticed something weird take shape. I was watching the sitcom and chuckled a little bit at a joke as my eyes began to close when something jolted me awake. I heard a harsh static coming from the TV and saw that it turned to static. I got up and went to turn it off, but it stopped as the TV turned itself off right as I reached the power button. I thought to myself, how weird was that? But eventually played it off as just a power outage and decided to head to sleep. All things considered, I slept great the first night and would only sleep relatively well that night. The next day, I went back into the city to try and get enough food for the day. To my surprise, people were more generous today on their way to work. I managed to get enough money to buy some food for the next few days. My newest problem was trying to find a way to get showered up and cleaned up. I figured I could shower in one of those convenience stores that had a shower. I had enough of my own soap and everything this time, so I didn't have to shoplift. That was a relief that made the shower feel all that more rewarding. I decided to go and wash my clothes in a nearby laundromat since I had enough left over to afford that. I would rather be clean and look clean enough to try and see if there was any way I could find work and finally get off the streets. I got a weird look from a couple of ladies when I came in with my bag and pack of detergent. I tried my best to ignore them, as I usually ignore people who give me weird looks when I enter places. I was on a mission, and I wasn't going to let these people deter me from getting my stuff clean before I went back to the streets. After my clothes were clean, I decided to head out along the main stretch of the city to look for places that I could apply for a job. After finding a decent restaurant with a laid-back but upscale atmosphere and a help wanted sign on the restaurant window, I decided to head on in and see if I could apply. After a bit of chatter, I managed to get an application out of the manager and filled it out. They tried to tell me that they would give me a call back if they were interested, but I had to explain how I didn't have a phone and I was on my own without letting them know that I was homeless. To my surprise, they sat me down and read through my application and decided to perform an impromptu interview. After a few questions, I managed to get confirmed for a job as a waiter there and felt a sense of thrill wash over me. I left that restaurant after giving my many thanks and made my way back to the mansion. I was so excited to start my new job the next day. My plan was to build up as much cash as I could while I stayed there to get my own place, a phone, a car, and everything else that I needed to finally be on the right track with my life towards something I could be proud of. If only things were ever as much as a walk in the park as that interview. I made my way back to the house and realized the TV was on. I started to panic and went to turn it off and started to search around the house. I pulled out my flashlight from my pack and started to make my way down all of the halls to investigate. My concern was that someone else had found out that someone broke into the house and was lurking around the estate. I made my way slowly and quietly down the halls, flashing my light into each of the rooms and peering around each corner. Each one of the rooms was covered in dust and were left either barren or had random furniture in them, so there weren't too many places whoever got in here could hide. I made my way to the back of the house and jumped when I heard something massive slam on the floor. My mind was racing now with what it could possibly be. A person, a beast, something worse. I wasn't sure. What could be at the end of this hallway? But I was running out of possibilities real fast. I turned the corner of the last section of the hallway on the 3rd floor and flashed my light towards the end. In a corner, 2 eyes reflected light back at me. I took a sigh of relief and realized that the thing looking back at me was a raccoon. I flashed a light at it and it ran towards a window and hopped out. It was one of the most bizarre things that have happened to me in a long time. I decided to head over to the ledge and flash my light down into the snow and saw that it had run off somewhere away from the house. With the raccoon gone, I felt calm enough to return to the mattress and try to get some rest. I could hear a low hum that night that kept waking me up, but it wasn't the worst thing I had to sleep through. The next day I went to work and managed to build up a nice amount of tips while I waited on a couple of dozen tables. It was a lot of work, but I managed to build up a reputation as a good waiter and collected just over $200. It was good enough for me to start considering where I could start looking to stay. It made me think about trying to get my life together, you know? This restaurant was upscale and had its own uniform set up, but seeing as how they provided me with everything that I needed, I would just need to keep it clean and I'd be set. I decided that I would only stay in the mansion for the rest of the week and work on building up my cash. My impulses were getting the best of me though. I went to one of my local dealers and decided to pay for a couple of tabs of acid to be able to celebrate. He cut me a good deal and sold me 2 tabs for $15, and I went on my way to grab some food and make my way back out to the mansion. That night was a lot of fun. Having turned on the TV right before I took one of the tabs, I started to have a ton of fun hallucinations take shape and felt more at peace with myself, which helped me fall asleep so I could be rested and ready for work again. I slept through most of the night but was jolted awake by the sound of things slamming in the house. I decided to look around again but couldn't find anything in the rooms like before. I made my way to the top of the house and looked down the hallway with my flashlight and came across 2 eyes. I froze because of where the 2 eyes were. I saw 2 white eyes reflecting back at me from the ceiling. I waved my flashlight at it and the thing crawled away down the hall. I slowly made my way around the house looking for those same eyes again, but I couldn't find them, whatever it was left, and I was once again alone. I couldn't really fall back asleep again, so I made my way out to work. Work was great and I brought in even more tips than yesterday, but I couldn't help but think about the thing I saw looking back at me in the mansion. It wasn't small, it only crawled on the ceiling. I saw it twist its head at me a couple of times to get a better look at me before I drove it off with the flashlight. After thinking about what it could have been, I assumed it was just the after effects of the acid tabs that I took that lingered with me after I woke up. Either way, I was thinking even harder about getting off the streets and was looking for apartments today. I found one that was housing people at just shy of $700 a month. They wanted a down payment on it, but it wasn't much. I figured that I could get the apartment payment sorted within a few more days, so I decided to work an extra hour in the night to try to earn a few more tips. It garnered me another $100 on top of the tips it earned me that night and made the apartment within my grasp. I wasn't content though. I wanted enough money to last me through that month so I wouldn't risk eviction in case something happened to my job or the tips started to dwindle. So I made my way back to the mansion again, and that night, everything started to get weird. I started to notice that there were tracks in the snow around the fence. I figured that some kids had decided to come and mess around the estate. I hope they enjoyed their exploration now because of the harsh reality of exploring and looking for a home when you have nothing is a lot less glamorous than going urban exploring. I liked the way that I felt when I took the tab of acid the night before, and despite my better judgment, I decided to take the second tab. Things were fine at first, and I decided to keep the TV off at night and just allowed my brain to roam the house. I went around the house laughing as different paintings of the family that used to live there took funny shapes. I was having a good time until I saw a large figure at the end of the hallway, looming in the corner like everything else I would shine my flashlight at did. I waved my flashlight at it, and it didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I started to back away, realizing that this figure was easily a foot taller than me. I moved my flashlight in the process, trying to make sure that I didn't fall over the furniture that the raccoon had knocked over. When I put in my flashlight back at the corner though, the figure was gone. I decided to look around the house some more, but couldn't find that figure again. Something about this house just didn't seem right. Maybe it was the acid, maybe it wasn't. Things were making less and less sense when I came back to the living room and saw the TV was on. I didn't remember turning it on, but I was too tired after all of that to care. I turned it off and went to sleep on the mattress. I slept a little more soundly that night, but woke up extra early to a loud slam. I wanted to see if it was another raccoon, but I didn't have the time to explore before I headed off to work again. I grabbed what was important and decided to head out with everything that I needed, rather than leave it unattended and risk someone looting all of my money and supplies that I had gathered. I now realize that doing that was probably the smartest decision I've ever made. I made my way to work and managed to make even more tips that day, surprisingly having enough money left over after my shift for the apartment, a prepaid phone, a nice meal, and some more acid. I decided to skip on the acid and went ahead to reserve myself an apartment and went looking for a prepaid phone. I didn't find the one that I wanted, and I'm glad that I decided to skip on it after all. I bought a nice meal for myself and made my way to the mansion after. It was a satisfying day for me, all in all, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed on the way back up to the estate. As I made my way through the snow, I kept seeing shadows all around me, and I could hear crunching noises, as if someone's boots were crunching in the snow and rocks underneath them. I made my way quickly back into the mansion and tried to settle in for the night. I turned on the TV and tried to use it to relax for a bit, but that was ruined when I heard a loud screeching noise come from the TV box. I tried to turn it off, but the power button stopped working. I then tried to look for the cable to the TV and realized that it was fried and was permanently connected to the power outlet. I tried tearing it out of the wall, but that didn't work. Right as I was almost about to pull the cable out, the TV stopped making that screeching noise, and I decided to inch my way over to the front of it. What I saw made me fall back onto the mattress, and is something I don't think I'll ever be able to forget. A single large hand loomed on the screen, outstretched and open, as if trying to grasp at something. It was just hung there in the static, almost as if it was trying to reach out through the television to grab me. And that's when I heard the voice that I will not forget.
"It appears that we have a trespasser here, Master Wolf. What would you suggest that we do with him?"
The sound of an old-timey butler that you would hear in famous movies rung loud through the TV, almost like a bell when it hit me. The voice that followed got me back up on my feet and set me into a run.
"Bring them to me."
I grabbed my belongings and began to run, only looking back to see the TV had turned off, and I started to hear voices and noises surround me as I ran. Shadows of outstretched hands began to take shape in the snow as I ran away from the house. The closer I got to the gate, however, the sooner I realized that there were footsteps chasing after me. I ran faster and threw my bag over the fence as I made my way through the gap. But right as I was about to exit the estate, something grabbed my shoulder and caused me to scream as I tugged and pulled away from whatever had grabbed me. I looked back after it tore part of my shirt off and I fell into the snow. What I saw will be imprinted into my brain for the rest of my life. I looked back and saw the image of a baby on the top of the fence with white eyes and sharpened teeth, and right below it was a man surrounded in shadows, like the baby above it, with glowing eyes and pointed white teeth. I grabbed my pack and didn't look back at the house anymore as I ran out of the neighborhood and ran back into the city. I realized when I got into town that it was a good thing that I didn't buy the phone just yet and could afford a hotel for the night, at least before I got into my new apartment before the week was done. I rested a little bit easier that night, knowing that I had left the house behind for the last time and wouldn't be going back. The next day I went to work with a figment of both of those figures imprinted into my mind and decided that regardless of whether they were real or fake, I wouldn't return back to that house ever again. Been about a week since I was last in that house, and I managed to get a prepaid phone and get into my new apartment. Work is going well, and I managed to put together the money to buy a cheap mattress and a cheap laptop so I could communicate with my family. I bought brand new white shirts and shorts so I could look somewhat clean when I did a call with them over the laptop to let them know that I was still alive and doing okay. I told them the story of my time at Wolf Mansion on Wolfridge Drive, but none of them believed me. All they had to say was lay off the acid. As much as I wanted to say that they had a point, I don't think that everything was hallucinated. I still can't explain everything that I saw there, but one thing is for certain. I won't go back to the last house on Wolfridge Drive.
For as long as I can remember, I have had something of a hyperactive imagination. I get lost in extremely vivid daydreams, and I'm not just talking crap when I use the word vivid. I can smell the scents in the air and feel the texture of the objects beneath my fingers. If I eat or drink something, I can taste it. The wind ruffles my hair and the ground is solid beneath my feet. These daydreams are so hyper-realistic, I have trouble discerning where the dream ends and reality begins. This interesting little quirk always came in handy on the long trips my family took to Florida when I was a kid. It's a pretty long way to go, especially when I was just still a squirmy little bobble-headed toddler who absolutely hated flying in airplanes. Even though the journey itself was always a drag, it was always nice to be able to get away from the cold for a while. You start to forget the feel of the heat of the sun on your face, and the endless weeks of gray skies and threatening cloud cover start to drive you crazy. Mom and Dad would work their butts off all year to be able to afford the trip, clocking in overtime and clipping coupons all so we could pack our bags and head off to experience a brief respite from the bitter embrace of Old Man Winter. And it was always worth it. Every single penny. The year I turned 16, my dad decided it would be wise to invest in an RV, which would cut down on our travel cost in the long run. I thought our little house on wheels was the greatest thing I had ever seen. I begged my parents to allow me to live in the RV until it got too cold in the fall, but Mom was not having it. She claimed I would probably sneak in on my friends at night to drink beer and smoke pot, which of course was exactly what would have happened. Mom was no fool. 5 months after Dad first parked the RV in our driveway, we were hitting the frosty highway and rolling south. It was the first time I'd ever seen the countryside between our hometown and our destination on such a close and personal level. And throughout the journey, I was at turns amazed, astounded, and bored to tears. I watched DVDs and lost myself in daydreams to pass the hours away, but by the time we rumbled past the Georgia-Florida state line, I was more than ready to put my feet on solid ground for a while. Flying may be expensive and stressful, but it is a heck of a lot faster. We stopped at a rest station near Lake City to load up on vending machine snacks and pump out the sewage tank. As I was checking out the candy bar selection, a deeply tanned older man in a polo shirt and white cargo shorts came wandering up to join me at the vending machine. He looked like a veteran actor of the big screen, still well built in his middle age and handsome in a generic, all-American kind of way. I looked over at him and thought, this guy could sell a ton of kitchen appliances on the Home Shopping Network. He flashed a pearly white grin and said, "I like those Snickers bars the best. Leave me a couple, would ya?" I gave him a dutiful smile in return, and started making polite small talk. I learned his name was Devin, and he was some kind of business big shot back in Arizona. I asked if he had come to Florida to do some wheeling and dealing, and my rest stop acquaintance waved the suggestion away with an air of vague annoyance. He said, "Come on now, everyone needs a vacation now and then. And I've been kicking around on this planet for all these years, and I've never seen a real, honest-to-goodness swampland. Now, do not get me wrong. The deserts and the plains are pretty damn magnificent. But hell, you gotta get out there and experience new things. You know what I mean? I want to take it all in. I want to sample everything a place like Florida has to offer." Mom yelled at me across the parking lot to hurry up and get my ass in gear, and I realized I had been well on my way to becoming hypnotized by the soothing cadence of Devin's voice. All at once, a small chill skittered down the length of my spine. Something about that grin was making me feel more than a little anxious. I could not help but think that Devin, the businessman from Arizona, wasn't smiling so much as he was baring his pearly white teeth at me. His gaze was just a little too sharp for someone having a casual conversation with a stranger. I felt like I was being studied, categorized, and filed away for future consideration. I took a few steps back and muttered, Well, I gotta go. Nice meeting you. Pleasure was all mine, son, he called after me, still smiling. I hurried back to the RV with the strangest feeling that I had just had a near miss with disaster. For the rest of the duration of the drive to the campgrounds, I kept scanning every passing vehicle for a figure with an aggressively friendly slash of a smile beneath eyes that never seemed to blink. I did not see him, but I could not shake the notion that Devin from Arizona was following us. We pulled into the campground shortly before noon. Dad backed the RV into our rented lot and sprang into action, humming the theme to the A-Team as he hooked up the water and the electricity, buzzing around in his electric blue clam digger shorts and matching flip-flops like a tacky little tornado. It was the third week of January, but it was a beautiful 71 degrees outside with a clear blue sky. I could smell the ocean in the breeze and the warmth of the sun's rays against my face. It was intoxicating. When we had pulled out our driveway to hit the road, it had just started snowing again, and it was cold enough to freeze the mucus inside of my nostrils. It felt good to be away from the gray drudgery of ice and slush, even if it only was for a couple of weeks. I blinked up at the sky and felt my earlier anxiety slide off my shoulders. We were finally here, and for the next few weeks, all would be well. Ma and Pa were both pretty bagged from the long day on the road, so we had a mellow day of hanging out beneath the fold-out canopy and roasting hot dogs on our mini-grill. I slept like a rock that night, and when I woke up the next morning, I was raring and ready to do some exploring. My parents had chosen a campground beside one of Florida's many conservation areas that year. I'd been given a new digital camera for my birthday and was excited to use it. Now, keep in mind, this was back in the days before cell phones came equipped with half-decent cameras. In fact, I did not even have a mobile phone yet, and would not for several more years. Mom and Dad popped out of the RV at the last second, and instead they tagged along if only to make sure I did not somehow fall into the jaws of the alligators that lived in the stagnant waters of the swamps. I had been planning to burn a bowl or two behind a cypress tree or something, so I was less than enthusiastic when I heard this news. Mom just gave me a knowing smile and patted me on the top of my head. Once again, my mom was no fool. We wandered into the park and took a map from a display in front of a dilapidated building with a faded sign that proclaimed it to be the Visitors Information Center. I noticed a tall man leaning on the ledge at the open sliding window, chatting with the Parks and Rec worker inside, and I realized with a nasty start that it was none other than Arizona Devin, the vaguely menacing tourist I had met at the rest stop the day before. He appeared to be flirting with the woman working the information booth, and if the entranced expression on her face was any indication, it appeared to be working. Mom grunted. "Come on, kiddo, let's go get eaten alive in this dirty damn swamp." She hauled me away by the arm, Dad stomping along behind us in his mirrored sunglasses and a ridiculous smear of zinc oxide along the length of his nose. My mom managed to convince him to change out the flip-flops, but he refused her demand to not change into another pair of his cringe-inducing clam diggers. They were banana yellow in color, and they flapped around his shins as he walked, which provided enough hilarity for me to almost forget about the unexpected appearance of Mr. Arizona, with his impeccably combed hair and sparkling slash of a grin. Almost, that is. I looked back over my shoulder just in time to see Devin disappearing through the front door of the building, which was being held open for him by the woman from the information booth. She had an expression of rapturous adoration in her face, as if she were completely enthralled by his presence. The door clunked shut, and I found myself slowing to a halt, staring after them, with a strange lump of dread in my stomach. Dad blundered into me from behind and bellowed, "Watch where you're going, dummy. I'm trying to look at the map here." I scurried away from his irritation and hurried after my mom, who was marching along the trail at a brisk power walker's pace. She snapped, "Hurry up, you two. You both need more exercise. Especially you, Harold. You sit there every night eating those potato chips and watching the TV. And you just look at that gut. You're starting to look pregnant." Dad muttered. Huh, you're a riot, ain't ya? And shoved the map in his back pocket. Mom militantly marched us along the trail like a drill instructor, hectoring us to keep up the pace, until we finally rebelled and stopped at a footbridge to take some pictures. The footbridge spanned a watery stretch that deepened as it led out into deeper reaches of the swamp. As I looked down into the dark sheen of the sluggish water below our feet, there was a rolling disturbance on the surface, and I caught a brief glimpse of a thick, scaly tail. I tried to snap a quick picture, but the alligator was already gone, leaving only bubbles and ripples in its wake. Dad whistled and said, "Holy moly, that was a big one. I read they don't really attack people very often, but I sure as hell don't want to get too close to one if I could help it." Mom smirked and made a jab about alligators preferring a low-fat diet, which made Dad clench his teeth and shoot back, "You're right. What am I scared of alligators for when I already live with a goddamn harpy?" They started to bicker at each other, and I interrupted by pointedly clearing my throat and grumbling, "Mom, Dad, can you guys just walk ahead of me or something? Argue somewhere I don't gotta hear it for crying out loud?" Mom snapped, "Why, so you can smoke some pot? Fine, come on Harold, let your pothead son get his fix or whatever he calls it. Let's go." Dad shot me a dark look and growled, "You better not have any dope on you, kid." We drove across state lines. They walked away in a huff, still taking cranky little jabs at each other, and I shook my head as they stomped out of sight. As soon as they were gone, I pulled out my pipe and my bag. Mom was right, of course. I offered my father a silent apology and packed a bowl. The swamp took on an ethereal, dreamlike quality as the THC soaked into my brain. I was still pretty new to smoking pot, and like most beginners, when I got high, I got really high. The smoke hit me like a sack of spongy bricks. Whomp. And I was soon blinking out at cypress trees with red eyes and a dopey grin on my face. It struck me that this was an ancient place, fundamentally unchanged for thousands of years. I drifted into a daydream of what life had been for the first human inhabitants. Generation after generation, living and dying within the groves, stalked by panthers and stalking them in turn, dancing around a fire beneath a blaze of stars over the canopy, sweating in syncopated rhythm in the humid air, hunting and fighting and loving and fearing the embrace of death. A hand suddenly descended on my shoulder, making me screech and jump 6 inches in the air. I whirled around and discovered the lady from the Visitors Information Center standing behind me. She let out a strangely mechanical giggle and said, "Whoa, you're a jumpy one, aren't you? I think one of you guys must have dropped this." She handed me a dirty, wrinkled map, the same map my dad stuffed into the back pocket of his hideous shorts earlier in our ill-fated family hike through the park. I took it from her and offered a sheepish apology for littering. She gave me a grin and chirped, "Hey, no problem, accidents happen. Where'd your parents go?" I knew that she could smell the weed in the air. I tried to put on an air of casual unconcern and said, "Oh, they're just up a little way. I trailed off and stared at her with growing unease. There was something about the park lady's grin that was unsettlingly familiar. "I gotta get going," I finished and tried to smile back. "Thanks for picking up the map for us. See ya." I took maybe 5 steps before I was stopped dead by the sound of Devin's voice booming out from behind me. Full of hearty and dark good humor, he said, "I peeked into your head, and I saw it too. The natives and fire, the stars in the night sky, all of it. You have got the sight, kid. I knew from the moment I smelled your scent at the rest stop. A lot of people have a touch of the sight, just a touch, but not like you. In another life, you would have made a great medicine man." I slowly turned around with my heart beating hard in my chest. The lady from the information booth was gone, and Devin stood in her place. He held up a red hairband and said, "That's all I need. A life, a personal item, and there it is. I will own her face for the rest of my years. Pretty neat trick, huh?" I gaped at him, too shocked to speak out loud. Finally, I cleared my throat and squeaked, What are you? Holy crap, how did you do that?" Devin tucked the hairband in the breast pocket of his shirt and said, "Well, I guess you could call me a witch. A very specific kind of witch. Folks back home would call me a skinwalker. Personally, I don't like that name very much, but it's what they'd call me." I slowly shook my head, my jaw hanging open in shock, and Devin clicked his tongue in disappointment. "It's true. No, I would tell you something. Boy, I'm an old son of a gun. No. I can remember watching Abraham Lincoln roll past in a convoy of horse-drawn buggies. That is how old I am. See this face here? This is not me. I killed this man in the bottom of a gas station years ago. Ate him right up. My real face? Well, you don't ever want to see that, believe me. If I show you my true face, it'll be the last thing you ever see." I could do nothing but shake my head again. I was struggling to keep myself from fainting dead away from fright. Devin beamed at my fear and shook his head in unison with my mute denial. He exclaimed, "Well, you're going to see for yourself, one way or another. Let us get down to business, partner. I'm a businessman, after all. See, I am tired of kicking around the empty old desert all the time. Everyone needs a vacation now and then. Sure, but me, I need something more substantial than that. Call it a leave of absence, if you will. I want to see the world, but it is not nearly so much fun when you're doing it alone. It would be nice to have a travel buddy or two. I could teach you, kid. I could show you how to be like me. I could teach you how to wear different faces. You could live so long it might as well be forever. What do you think of that?" My answer was to abruptly whirl around and start running my ass off. I tried to get off the footbridge as quick as possible. The thing behind me snarled. That was a real bad choice, kid." And heavy footsteps pounded on the splintery old boards behind me. I screamed for help, but the air around me became thick and curiously flat. My voice fell dead inches from my lips.
"Ain't nobody gonna help you,"
the skinwalker screamed, and in his voice it was so dark and triumphant with hunger, the confident greed of a predator who never fails to secure its prey. I do not know if it was from the extreme stress of the situation at hand, but all at once my mind drifted sideways, and from one footfall to the next I stepped out of reality and into the daydream. The natives were gathered at the other side of the bridge, the ancient one from another time. They looked like they were pissed right off. One of them drew back his bow and uttered a hoarse war cry and let the arrow fly. The stone-tipped projectile whistled past my head and I heard it thunk into my pursuer. It was only a scant moment away from sinking its claws into my back. It let out a jagged screech of surprise and agony. I turned just in time to see a towering, slump-shouldered figure stagger back into a guardrail and flip over to the water below with a tremendous splash. The arrow was protruding from its eye socket. The monstrous thing fought and struggled to the surface. It had time to roar.
"I'll leave you alive."
And then a churning commotion boiled in with eerie speed. Several streaks of boiling water and whipping tails from all directions. The skinwalker opened his cavernous mouth to scream again, and it was yanked underneath with tremendous force. There was more gurgled screaming, a lot of flailing of arms and legs, and the water went red with blood. Devin the skinwalker may have been a big deal out there in the deserts of Arizona, but in the watery swamplands of central Florida, the mighty alligator reigned supreme. I stood at the bank and watched as its struggles grew rapidly weaker. When I saw an arm float to the surface, I knew it was done. I started to turn away, but something bobbling in the water caught my eye. I fished it out with a stick and stared at it with horror. I had been hoping the whole incident was just a part of my hyper-realistic daydream, but the dripping hair tie I was holding was very real. I tucked it away in my pocket and whispered, "Tourists gotta watch out for the gators, Devin. Everyone knows that." I was surprised to see the natives from the daydream were still gathered near the end of the bridge. I raised a hand to them, and they returned my greeting. their faces solemn and watchful. One of them pointed to himself, then to me, and then up to the sky. With that, they faded away into nothing before my eyes. I am not completely sure what he was trying to say. Not exactly, but I think I got the gist of it. He was a part of me, and we were both parts of a greater reality. I hurried up to catch my mom and dad before I stepped to throw up into some bushes. My heart was pounding, and my legs were shaking uncontrollably. I felt like I might pass out. I gasped, "Holy crap," and I wiped my mouth with the side of my shirt. Wow, now I know this is a pretty big pill to swallow, but there's still more. After I was finished tossing up my breakfast, I ran ahead on the trail, but I could not find my parents anywhere. I eventually doubled back and found them standing on the bridge, yelling my name at the top of my lungs. Mom freaked the hell out when I came jogging up to them. She said they came sneaking back to the bridge shortly after they'd left, in an effort to catch me in the act of smoking my illicit dope, but I was nowhere to be seen. It was almost as if I had disappeared into thin air. Dad spotted what looked like a shoe floating just below the surface, and they both promptly went into hysterics. They thought I actually somehow ended up falling into the water and was eaten alive by gators. I looked down into the water, and there was in fact a shoe bobbing around a few yards away from the bridge. It was one of Devin's spiffy boat shoes, and I was fairly sure there was still a foot inside of it, although I obviously did not share this fact with my parents. It must have broken off during the feeding frenzy. Staring at it made a wave of nausea roll through my guts, and I promptly looked away. I calmed my parents down by telling them that they were right. Being the conniving teenage miscreant that I was, I had tricked them into walking ahead, and that I'd slipped away from the trail to smoke a few bowls because I was a dirty, disrespectful little bastard of a pothead. I stoically endured the rain of slaps delivered by my enraged mother, who had been a mere second away from melting down into a full-blown fit before I came scrambling down the trail. They confiscated my pipe and weed, and Mom declared that I was grounded for the duration of the vacation. No TV, no sightseeing, no fun at all. I pretended to be heartbroken with disappointment, but in reality that was just fine and dandy by me. I just had more than enough excitement to last me quite a while. I overheard my mom and dad talking about the disappearance of a park employee the next day. Dad put forth the possibility that the shoe he had seen in the water may have belonged to her, and Mom, being a true crime fanatic since the early 90s, breathlessly speculated she may have been killed by a jilted ex-boyfriend. I gazed into an open magazine and pretended not to hear the conversation. The shoe had not belonged to the missing park employee, but the hair tie in my pocket certainly did, and I knew the police would never find her body. She had been devoured, whole and screaming, by a monster wearing stolen skin. And then, in an ironic twist of fate, the ancient creature finally got a taste of its own medicine, so to speak, at the jaws of the alligators. Sorry about that. I do not usually like puns, but this one time, I could not resist. As for me, I still have daydreams sometimes, although it is never as vivid and real to me as it was when I was a kid. As the years passed, I found myself doubting the incident, and actually, I thought that maybe I made it up at one point. It seems far more likely that I suffered from some kind of epileptic, petit mal seizures, as kids sometimes do, and the whole thing was just an hallucination or something. Or, so I tell myself anyway. It does not explain the hair tie, nor does it explain the broken arrow shaft floating in the water. I ended up throwing the hair tie out the window as we were heading back home, up the I-95. I didn't want it anymore. Looking at it made me feel weird, and, I don't want to have evidence like that on me. I may have possessed the power of clairvoyance once upon a time. Or I may have had a childhood neurological disorder. I cannot say for sure which one is correct. But I can say this. Even monsters need to go on vacation now and then. And when they do, they should probably stay within their element, if they know what I mean. Because no matter how big and bad a monster you are, there is always something a whole lot worse.
This isn't a Bigfoot story. So if that's what you're looking for, move on.
I only wish what I experienced that night was a giant, hairy bipedal ape. Maybe then I could rationalize it in my head that I'd only seen a bear and would be able to move on with my life. If only it were that simple. It was Thanksgiving break in the fall of '89. I was 19 years old and in my sophomore year at the University of Arkansas. All my friends were headed home for the week, but home didn't seem like an option for me right now. But that's not what this story's about. It'd been a particularly rough couple of months, and quite frankly, I wasn't in the Thanksgiving mood. The thought of being surrounded by family, by anyone for that matter, seemed incredibly claustrophobic. I needed the outdoors and solitude. I'd never gone on a hike in my life. I'd grown up hunting and camping in the natural state, so I was around the wilderness. But starting at point A and walking to point B never really interested me. Not until now, anyway. On many of my drives home, down a scenic Highway 23, or the Pig Trail as we referred to it, I'd seen the crossing for the Ozark Highland hiking trail, but never had gone and given it a second thought. Now, however, it was almost audibly calling my name. A few days earlier, I bought a map of the Ozarks, which showed several different hiking trails. This was way before GPS and smartphones, and I plotted my course. The plan was to drop my car off at the Pig Trail, crossing and have my roommate take me further up the trail on his way home. It wasn't too far out of his way, so he didn't mind. Like I said, we didn't have GPS or phones, but I was a 19-year-old guy in great shape and going to live forever, so I never gave it a second thought. In my mind, all I needed was my map, a compass, some food, water, tent, and a sleeping bag, and I was set. I couldn't wait to get out into the open air, away from school and away from everybody. So, on Saturday morning we left the dorms around 10 o'clock, deposited my car on 23, and I was at my starting point, a couple miles north of the little town of Ozark, sometime before noon. It was a brisk and beautiful fall day in the Ozark Mountains, and life was good again. The total expedition looked to be around 25 miles, so I figured I'd take it 3 days max. But I wasn't in any hurry. I had plenty of food, and there were multiple creeks along the way, so if it took the entire week, well, it wouldn't bother me one bit. The first day was great. I took it real slow, making my way around and down a mountain towards this valley. It was just what I needed. Everything was perfect, right up until about 30 minutes after making camp. I'd stopped at the base of the valley where the trail crossed the Little Mulberry Creek. It was a great spot. I built a small fire and set my tent. I just settled back and enjoyed the sunset when a group of 4 guys had arrived and made camp about 50 yards away. It wasn't too bad until they turned on their CD player. Really? Why would you come out into nature only to turn on your stereo? After about the 3rd time through Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry Be Happy, I was ready to pull my hair out. The next morning, I was up and out before my neighbors began to stir. I didn't want to run the risk of anywhere being near them while I hiked. Again, it was another wonderful day. The beauty of the Ozarks at the time of year is something to see. They're not really mountains per se, more like giant rolling tree-covered hills. When the leaves change and fall, it's simply spectacular. By the time I reached my next planned campsite, Indian Creek, it was getting close to dusk. I could have walked a little further, but again, I wasn't in any hurry to get back, and I'd much rather be near water overnight. I surveyed the surroundings and picked a spot, but recalling the previous night's futility, I looked up the creek. I didn't want to run the risk of a repeat, if those guys were still on the trail anyway. So, I decided to follow it north, away from the trail. I picked up my backpack and started walking at a brisker pace. I wanted to get as far out of earshot as possible before sunset. I guessed I'd gone about 2.5 miles north before finding a nice cozy spot near the creek. Being in another valley, the sun was already behind the mountain, but I still had enough light to finish camp. By the time the fire was going good, the stars were shining bright in a cloudless sky, framing a perfectly full moon. The night was glorious. It seemed late, but couldn't have been much past 10 p.m. when I gave in to drowsiness and crawled inside the tent. I'm not sure what time I stirred, but the fire was nothing more than a few glowing embers, so it must have been several hours later. It wasn't anything specific that woke me, nothing aside from the absolute stillness of the night. It had been somewhat breezy before turning in, with the crickets loudly chirping. Now, nothing. Even the trickling creek directly outside seemed muted. This was the first moment I can recall a bit of uneasiness creeping over me. My stomach tingled with a slight touch of anxiety as I poked my head out of the tent. It was so quiet and bright. Without the fire illuminating camp, the moon and stars could bathe the creek bed in their light. I crawled the rest of the way out and sat up and listened. Ever so faintly, further north I could just barely make it out. A baby? Crying? Out here? Could there be a house somewhere, way out here? Maybe another family of hikers? It seemed unlikely, and sounds like they could travel forever here. Maybe it was further than I thought. I sat and listened. Surely, if it was a house nearby, the baby's mother would come and comfort the child. The crying continued, growing more and more distinct. Now, I'd worked the night shift, buffing floors at the local hospital, and I'd been up in the labor and delivery ward. I knew what it sounded like when a baby was hungry or fussy, and I knew what it sounded like when they stuck one of them with a needle. It's a distinctly different sound of crying. This was a needle-sticking cry. Something was not right. I've read studies about the sound of a baby crying does to someone, even to dogs and cats. It unleashes this primal need, for lack of a better phrase, do something about it. I didn't know about that then, but looking back now, I wish I did. Instinct were pulling me to respond. Gradually, I rose and grabbed my flashlight. I quickly discovered I could see better with the light on, so I attached the strap to my belt loop and continued north. The crying grew louder and more urgent the further I went. I was getting close. The creek disappeared around the bend to the right, but I could tell I was now standing between the water and the baby. I could see a slight opening into the brush that looked like an old pathway. If not for the cries from the baby, I would easily assume it was just another game trail. I summoned all the courage I could muster and plowed ahead through the brush. With each step I took, my sense of trepidation grew. Just as I started to reach for my light, the brush around me began to open up. Desperate cries pounded in my head as I jogged faster towards the opening up ahead. When I broke through, I was standing at the edge of a small clearing. The moonlight revealed a small, rugged shack about 40 yards ahead on the opposite side. It had a single-room cabin with a stone chimney on the left rusted tin roof as a cover. Its lone, front-facing window, in the air, hung the stench of a hard-grain alcohol and hate. I shuddered. About halfway between the shack and me, off to the right sat an old water well and looked even older than the house. Its walls were made of stone. There were what appeared to be old railroad ties on either side supporting the wooden spool over the shaft. A hand crank stuck out from its side and an old rope wrapped the spool. but there was no bucket at its end. The well did not appear to have been used in a very long time. Cries jolted me back into the moment. The thought of approaching that shack flooded me in absolute terror. Something evil was inside that house, but the baby's shriek intensified and I willed my feet onward. I had taken only a few steps when the realization hit me with a lead weight. The screaming wasn't coming from the shack. It echoed up from the depths of that well. Suddenly, a woman burst through the cabin door, sending me to my knees in fright. Her tattered and dingy plaid dress billowed behind as her sprint towards the crying infant. "Lily May!" Her shrieks pierced my ears. She continued to wail until she reached the well. Again, she sobbed, "Lily May!" Now, into its mouth. I somehow managed to find my feet with trembling legs. I tried my best as I could to move ahead. I staggered towards her, but by the time I got there, she already wrapped the rope around her waist and tied it off. "Ma'am!" I shouted. "Ma'am, let me!" But she was over the edge before I could stop her. The wooden spool squealed and shook as she descended. Looking down into the shaft, all I could see was a few feet of rope and black nothingness. The crying was even more amplified as I stood directly above. Then the screeching spool by my head abruptly stopped. "Ma'am, I'll pull you out. Just let me know when you're..." A door slammed from behind, freezing me in place. The stench of moonshine reeked in the air and overwhelmed me. I turned to look, and there he stood on the porch. I tried to move, to yell out in fear, but my body betrayed me and didn't budge. He was a large man, wearing an old worn-out sweat-stained coveralls, which, even in the midday sun, shone bright, the original color of which could not have been known. His boots and hat matched the dirty brown look. Moonlight glistened off his sweaty, unshaven face while greasy streaks of dirt pooled into wrinkles around his neck. My attention was drawn down to what he held in his right hand, an old, well-worn wooden hatchet. I still couldn't move a muscle, as he methodically stepped off the porch and moved towards the well, towards me. With each deliberate step he took, the air pressure surrounding me dropped. It was like I was in a vacuum, with all the air being sucked out, replaced with hate. The cries from below grew louder as if they were inside my very head. I struggled to breathe, but the stink of sweat and liquor choked my lungs. He was mere feet from me now. As he raised the hatchet high in the air, I resigned myself to my fate. This was the end. As the hatchet came down, instinct overcame terror and I dropped to all fours. The sound of iron on wood echoed throughout the valley. I looked up. He towered over me, arm and hand still attached to the hatchet, attached to the spool. In one blow, he'd driven the tool deep into the wood, severing the rope and sending it deep into the bowels of the earth. The baby's cries had diminished now in what I can only guess the comforting arms of her mother, only to be replaced by the mother's screams of desperation. The man, never acknowledging my presence, turned back towards the shack and moved away at the same pace in which he had came. My eyes followed as he went, but he softly faded away before his first foot hit the porch. Instantly, I became aware of my labored breath, aware of the sound of my heart resounding in my head. Sweat dripped from my nose as I was drenched. I looked back again, and the shack was gone. Only a solitary stone fireplace stood there now. I struggled to my feet to find the well was different too. The wooden beams and wench was now gone, and a rusty metal lid sealed off the top. I could still hear the faint sobs from the mother beneath the steel sarcophagus, but even that faded now. Then, silence. A gentle breeze touched my face for the first time in what seemed ages, and I was suddenly cold. The trees rustled awake as a gust of wind rustled through the valley, breathing life back into the forest. A single cricket chirped back to life, signaling the rest that it was okay to sing again. I wasn't the only witness that night. They'd seen it too. I'm not sure how long it took me to stumble back to my camp, but by the time I sat down, the sun was just breaking over the crest of the valley. I must have sat there shaking for at least another hour. I was back to my car before following sunset, and when I turned onto the highway, I headed south, for home. It was my only option now. I wanted to see my mother, and tell her I was sorry. If you search the internet for Ghost Mountain, Arkansas, you'll find the story of how on a moonlit night in the 1930s, a drunken man threw his sick child into a well. You'll read that after his hysterical wife went in after it, he cut the rope she used and left them there to die. How on certain nights, when the moon's full, you can still hear the mother's screams and the cries from that baby emanating from the belly of the well. Now mind you, the internet won't give an exact location. It only speaks in generalities and tells you to talk to the locals. The problem is, they're not looking in the right place. I've visited that well many nights in my sweat-soaked dreams, heard that mother scream, seen that terrible man. I'll never be rid of them. I've since married and divorced. I've told my wife weeks into our relationship I've never wanted children, and said she was okay with that. She lied. Years later she begged. She asked, "Why won't you have children? I've seen you with them, you're great, you'd be a great father." I'd answer, No, never. I told you from the beginning I do not want children. I don't like them. That was also a lie. I love children. I desperately want one of my own. The simple truth of the matter is I can't. The crying child inside my head that wakes me in the middle of the night is bad enough. I think a real one, night after night, will push me over sanity's edge, will push my mind back into that night, back to the bottom of that well, never again to see the light of day.